Are you worried about Social Security? Do you wonder how you're going to pay for your retirement? Well, at some point you'll get concerned, but right now you should probably be saving. The Social Security Administration is designed to provide income to people in their retirement years as a kind of public assistance program. It began after the Great Depression and was originally funded as an old age assistance program with a 2% payroll tax. People paid 2% of their income, up to $3,000, into the Social Security Trust Fund, which was a government-administered savings plan. Then in their retirement years, after 65, they could begin to withdraw Social Security benefits, which they could collect until they died. Now, what are you paying into Social Security today? About 15.3% of your paycheck goes into Social Security, either to pay for your retirement benefits or to pay for medical benefits under the Medicare plan. You pay half of it, and your employer pays half of it. Now, this money goes into the Social Security Trust Fund, and when you reach your early 60s, you'll begin to be eligible to withdraw money from this trust fund. Again, it kind of presents itself as a government-administered savings plan. You put the money in, it collects interest, and you take it out in your retirement years. But nowadays, the fund is in trouble because the withdrawals from the fund are increasing much faster than the payments into the fund. And people are beginning to ask, is Social Security in trouble? Does it need to be saved? I'll start by asking you the question, what are you expecting to get out of Social Security in your retirement years? And have you even thought about it? Well, the way that Social Security works, people pay in when they're young, so they feel entitled to take the money out when they're old. Or if you think about it this way, right now as a young person, your taxes are paying the benefits on older workers in their retirement years. So you have to look forward to that when you're old, young workers will be paying the taxes that support your retirement benefits. There's a kind of fairness to the whole thing. You should be able to get out something that you put in, or you pay your dues now, you get your benefits later. But the system is starting to show signs of strain and has been since the 1970s, and people are concerned that the fund is shrinking so rapidly that it may actually go bankrupt. In fact, under current assumptions, there will be no money at all left in the Social Security Trust Fund by the year 2030. What's going on? What's changed since the years after the Great Depression that have put our national retirement system in such jeopardy? Well, the first big change has been demographic. In the years when Social Security was first up and running, there were about 20 workers supporting each retired person. Nowadays, there have been big changes in demographics. One is people are living a lot longer. A person who retired at age 65 in the years following the Great Depression couldn't count on living that much longer by actuarial standards. Nowadays, you can count on living 20 years after you retire at age 65. So people are withdrawing from the trust fund a lot longer. Another thing is birth rates fell in the United States after the 1960s, and there are just a lot fewer people working per retired person than there were before. So longer life expectancies and a lower birth rate combine demographically to put strain on the system, and that's why the money in the trust fund has been shrinking. Another problem is that there have been a lot of programs added to Social Security. Now, not only do you collect money for retirement benefits, but you can also collect medical benefits under Medicare. You can also collect disability benefits, and if your spouse survives you, your spouse is eligible to collect Social Security survivor benefits. So the additional increase in benefits is taking money out of the system rapidly also. So what's going to happen now? What are the problems with the Social Security system, and how might they be fixed? Well, let's look first. One of the big problems with the Social Security fund as a savings plan is all the money is invested in government bonds. Congress has not allowed the Social Security fund to be invested in productive investments like factories and companies and anything that would pay high rates of interest. Rather, all the money is effectively borrowed by the government. It is invested in U.S. Treasury securities. So there's no real interest being generated anywhere because the money is not put to productive use. That means ultimately the Social Security Trust Fund is secure only to the extent that the government can raise taxes to pay off its own debt. So because the Social Security Trust Fund is entirely invested in government debt, there is no real productive stock of capital backing it. That is, the government's ability to tax. It's effectively a transfer program that taxes the young to pay benefits to the old. Therefore, its security rests on the ability to raise taxes to pay benefits. A second problem is that a lot of programs have been added without providing for the funding. That is, all of these extra medical and survivors benefits that have been added since the 1930s have been added with no provision for funding them. In the long run, the fund is going to have to be replenished by taxes raised on workers. But in the short run, Congress finds that it's politically advantageous to cater to powerful voting blocs, namely retired people, by giving them additional tasty retirement benefits. And there's been no real provision for how those benefits are going to be paid for. And young people notoriously don't vote with nearly the strength and organization that retired workers do. A third concern is that Congress is going to have to do something to benefits or taxes to make this thing stable, and this is where the politics come in. As I've already mentioned, these powerful voting blocs of retired people have consistently and strongly lobbied against any reduction in benefits, and you can't blame them. After all, they paid in Social Security money all of their working years. They feel entitled to the benefits that they were promised. At the same time, the younger workers are kind of oblivious to what's going on. We don't inform ourselves about what these taxes are for, and therefore we don't put pressure on Congress to reform the system somehow. So the taxes are going to have to be raised, and since there are fewer younger workers working to support retired workers, those increases in taxes may be pretty dramatic just to keep the system solvent, just to keep the fund from shrinking, much less build it up in any way. So, using current assumptions, the Social Security Trust Fund will be exhausted within 30 years. That means something radical has to be done. Well, before we go to proposals to save the Social Security system, let's consider in a broad sweep what could be done. One thing that could be done is the tax rates could be raised. Now, that's going to put a big squeeze on working people. I mean, taxes are already high in this country, and workers are struggling to make ends meet. So raising taxes is going to be a very unpopular proposal. The next thing is that benefits could be cut for people who are collecting money in their retirement years. But that's going to be tough because those people paid money in with an implicit contract that they would take benefits out at the rate at which they're collecting them, and therefore there's going to be a sense in which we are reneging on an agreement if we cut the benefits. So both increases in taxes and reductions in benefits are going to be unpopular. They may be necessary, but they're going to be extremely politically painful. Another way in which to reduce benefits would be to raise the retirement age and make the retirement age somehow a function of life expectancy. People are now vigorous and working well into their 70s, and therefore there may be no need for the government to provide public assistance type retirement payments to people who are in their early 60s, and this is something that we should certainly discuss. Again, people who paid money in 20 years ago were expecting to be able to start drawing money in their early 60s, so that's going to be viewed as a change in the contract, but it still may be something that's necessary. Clearly, there's no easy solution, or the problem would have been fixed a long time ago. The third thing to be addressed here, besides the taxes and the benefits, is the way in which the money is invested. Maybe all of it doesn't need to be linked to the government. In fact, that's probably a very, very poor use of the Social Security Trust Fund. Why not invest it in more productive assets, such as stocks and bonds and shares in companies and other things that yield high rates of return because they're productive business investments? Why not invest in private assets? This would certainly increase the return on savings and give Social Security more money to fund its obligations. This is going to be a concern, however, because to the extent that the Social Security Fund is invested in the stock market, then the government is going to be under pressure to keep the stock market from crashing, which means the Fed may lose its latitude to pursue independent monetary policy because now people say the Fed needs to pump money in anytime the stock market starts sagging because otherwise the Social Security Fund will be damaged. So there's all that problem. Then there's the whole horror of thinking about the government having to be accountable for all the different investments that it funds. Should we invest the Social Security Trust Fund in companies that produce cigarettes? What about companies that invest in countries that are run by dictators? I mean, all this would then put the U.S. government so deeply involved in the politics of investment that it would just, potentially create a political nightmare. So there we have that set of concerns. But be that as it may now, we've got three sets of plans to consider for reforming the Social Security system, and let's consider some of the advantages and disadvantages of each. First, President Clinton has offered his own plan for reforming Social Security, which is to dedicate 60% of the federal budget surplus, which we've recently been running, to replenishing the Social Security Trust Fund, and do this for 15 to 25 years, however many is necessary, and also to invest part of the trust fund in private securities. Now, to the extent that the trust fund is invested in private securities, then we're actually, in some ways, radically changing the Social Security system. However, if we just have the surplus invested in the present system, paying off government bonds earlier, that's no real change in the Social Security system. That's just paying down the national debt. It's a kind of accounting trick. It's not really setting aside savings that are going to be working to provide money for you in your retirement. A second set of concerns or plan are raised by another plan that's been offered by Senator John Breaux. And the Breaux plan involves the following steps. First of all, partial privatization, invest some of the money in private assets. Next, have the government subsidize people's individual savings. That is, cut some of the taxes on interest income and give people a tax advantage for putting money in savings accounts, like individual retirement accounts and 401ks, that will reduce the need for Social Security in the long run because people will substitute their private savings instead. And the third thing, of course, is cut the benefits and raise the taxes just to reduce the overall amount of money that is in the trust fund. The problem with privatization is, can we really trust people to manage their own retirement money? And now we're at this uncomfortable question that economists are always bumping into, which is, can we really trust people? Can we trust people to spend money well? Can we trust people to take care of themselves? I mean, think about this. I'm working today, and if I'm given the choice, I don't really want to pay taxes. But I also don't want to save money. I'd rather spend now and have a good time, which means that when I get to my retirement years, if I think I can count on the government to pay my way or to pay for my basic needs, then I don't have to be worried about being hungry in my retirement years, and therefore I don't save today. And this is what's called moral hazard. If I can pass the risk on to society at large, then I'm going to take more risks. And therefore, if we have a completely private Social Security system, it creates moral hazard and may discourage people from saving unless the government requires the savings. So a forced savings plan is one way of protecting those of us who do save from those of us who don't. I mean, I have this fear that all the money that I'm putting into my 401k plan and my retirement accounts is going to be taken away by the government whenever I get to be 70 years old because someone else won't have saved and the government has to raise taxes to provide for their public assistance. So I saved all this money, you didn't, now what's going to happen? I mean, that's a concern. But if I know the government is forcing you to save too, then I can rest easy and I have more of an incentive to save money now. So getting people to actually take responsibility for their retirement years is one of the things the Social Security system is doing right now because the government is taking responsibility for it. So if we privatize it, we've got to make sure that individuals have adequate personal incentives to see to their retirement savings rather than relying on the government to bail them out when they don't save enough by the time they retire. The third set of plans has been offered by the Government Advisory Commission on Social Security, and they couldn't agree on any single plan, so they actually came up with 3 plans of their own. Plan number 1 was to raise taxes and invest some of the trust fund in private markets. Plan number 2 was to cut benefits, raising the mandatory retirement age, and also to give incentives for people to start their own retirement accounts. And the third plan that was offered by the Advisory Commission was large mandatory individual retirement accounts. That is, privatize the whole thing. Let people start their own accounts, manage their own accounts, take the risk they want, and invest the money directly in stocks and bonds, and get the government out of the business of Social Security. Well, each of these plans has its own problems, as we've discussed, and the problems boil down to the politics of taking things away from people that they expected, and the problem of moral hazard, people who won't save unless they're made to save, and the question of what happens when the government gets involved in administering systems that involve the government responsibility for private companies. All of these are politically difficult things. So, maybe we're going to get lucky and the Social Security crisis isn't going to be as bad as we thought. It could be that this whole notion that there's going to be a crisis is based on faulty assumptions, such as that labor productivity wouldn't increase. After all, the only problem with 2 workers supporting one is that means huge tax rates on those 2 workers to pay the benefits that the first worker is expecting. However, if labor productivity is rising faster and faster, then you and I can afford to pay taxes at a higher rate without a reduction in our standard of living because our paychecks are just bigger because we're more productive. So a big increase in labor productivity will be a lucky break that could help reduce the pain of making good on Social Security obligations. The second assumption that we can call into question is inflation. Whenever we were worried about a crisis in Social Security in the 70s and 80s, that was back when the inflation rate was, 5 to 10%. Nowadays, it's been under 3% consistently for the last 5 years. Therefore, the amount of money that's going to be needed to pay for Social Security benefits for people who are going to be retiring in the coming years is going to be less than expected. So as long as inflation remains low, that works well for using the existing trust fund to pay off Social Security benefits for a longer period of time. If inflation heats up again, then we're going to need to raise taxes quicker to make good on our existing obligations. The third set of assumptions has to do with how many workers there are going to be. We've had lots of net immigration into the United States. Women are participating in the labor force in a much higher way than has been anticipated. So therefore, growth in the labor force is going to reduce the pressure on the other workers who were expected to shoulder the burden of Social Security. The final concern is with fertility. How many children are going to be born in the coming years who will be working in 2030 that will actually be paying money into the Social Security Trust Fund? And that depends entirely upon the behavior of potential parents today. We've had baby booms, we've had baby busts, lots more children born in the 50s and 60s than we expected, a lot fewer born in the 70s and 80s than you might have predicted, and demographers didn't do a very good job of predicting the ups and downs in the birth rate. So maybe we'll get lucky in some sense, and more families will have children who will be working age and paying into the Social Security Trust Fund. In the long run, however, we've got to answer the question, who should provide for retirement? Who should take care of people's needs in their years when they're no longer able to work? And the notion that the government should be involved pretty much rests on the belief that if you let people do this for themselves, they won't save enough. And therefore, in their old age, they will become dependent on public assistance and dependent on taxes for their care. If the government were to use a forced savings plan and let people decide how they wanted to manage the money, what kind of risks they wanted to take, we'd still have all kinds of problems with that system, but it would be a different set of problems than we have with the Social Security system now, completely administered by the government. Where is the government's role in retirement planning? Until we answer that question, we're not going to be able to craft what we think is the best system for providing for people in their retirement years. But clearly, the way demographics are going now, there is some trouble ahead for Social Security. And the best advice to you is save what you can in your private accounts and provide for your own retirement. And also vote so that you can express to the government your preference about how taxes and benefits are distributed in any kind of public assistance retirement program.